Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. We've seen teams switch coaches in the middle of a season before, and there's usually one or two teams a year where this will be the case. Maybe the coach isn't the right fit, and the owner or the general manager decides it's a good idea to fire him. Maybe the coach has to step down due to health issues. Maybe the coach just decides to leave in the middle of the season because he feels like it. Whatever the case, teams switching coaches at some point in the season is not unusual, and it's something that we've grown accustomed to in every sport, including football. But what about a team switching coaches in the middle of a game? What about a situation where at the midway point, a new coach, who wasn't there when the game began, steps into the fold? That would be incredibly bizarre. There's a ton of reasons why something like this is not a good idea. However, that's kind of what happened with the Boston Patriots during the 1970 season. In a game against the Buffalo Bills, the Patriots decided midway through to switch coaches. And this is the story of the bizarre incident. Before I talk about the actual switch itself, we need some context to understand the team and the man in question and how we got to one of the strangest coach games in NFL history. In 1969, fresh off of the heels of leading the New York Jets to a shocking victory at Super Bowl III, Jets offensive coordinator Cleve Rush was a hot coaching commodity. The Boston Patriots, coming off of an awful 1968 campaign where they went 4-10, and an awful 2 years under head coach Mike Gogolak where they were one of the worst teams in the American Football League, were looking for a new head coach. And with that, the Pats poached Rush away from the Jets and made him their new head coach. Rush's tenure in Boston got off to an unbelievably bad start, and it started with the opening press conference, which would be a horrible sign of things to come. I made a video about this more than a year ago if you want to learn more about it by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But to make a long story short, Rush almost died at his introductory press conference after being electrocuted by a microphone wire. Things would not get better from there, as the 1969 season, the last before the merger between the AFL and the NFL, was more the same, as once again the Patriots were one of the worst teams in the league. Boston finished the season with a 4-10 record. With the exception of the Miami Dolphins, no team in the league had fewer wins than the Patriots did. They scored just 266 points, finishing with the third worst offense in the league, which is not good when the head coach was hired because of his background working with an offense. The Pats lost their first 7 games, including one absolutely abysmal shutout against the eventual Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs, where they lost 31-0, picked up 82 yards of total offense, and had a grand total of 6 first downs. But this wasn't just your ordinary bad season, because you also had the time that the head coach tried to kill his players. And I'm not talking about overworking them in a practice or going too hard on them in a drill. No, I mean literally kill the players. In Week 13, the Patriots lost 28-18 to the San Diego Chargers, in an incredibly sloppy game where Boston turned it over 4 times. Rush was so frustrated about the loss that after the game, as the team was driving back to the airport, he ordered the bus driver to drive down the off-ramp of the freeway in the opposite direction. For some inexplicable reason, the bus driver complied, and the Pats team bus was going in the opposite direction on a one-way road. As one player said afterwards, "We hung on for our lives." The BC and Holy Cross graduates on the team all began to say Hail Marys as the bus sputtered along the highway with every car whizzing by the other way. As you can probably guess, the 1970 season did not go much better. Somehow, Rush was not in jail after that season, and somehow he stayed on as the head coach for another year. I genuinely have no idea how you survive literally ordering the bus driver to break the rules of the road and trying to get your teammates killed as punishment for losing a game, but here he was, still around when the Patriots were playing football in the NFL in 1970. Honestly, the entire 1970 season was a catastrophic debacle that deserves its own video, because there are tons of ridiculous things that happened with Rush and the Pats, one of which includes the time Rush found one of his former players in the stands who was going to the game as a fan and decided to dress him up for the game. No, I am not making that up. And unsurprisingly, the Patriots were awful to start things off. After defeating the Miami Dolphins on opening day by a final score of 27-14, things took a nosedive as the team lost its next 5 games. There was a 31-21 home loss to the New York Jets, where the Patriots were down 28-7 at one point in the second half, and where the Jets had 187 rushing yards compared to just 70 for the Patriots. There was a 14-6 loss to the Baltimore Colts, where the Patriots actually didn't play terribly. All things considered, it was a pretty even contest against a team that would eventually win the Super Bowl, so I don't really have a whole lot of material to dunk on them for here. The same can't be said about the following week, when they lost 23-10 to the Chiefs, in a game where starting quarterback Mike Taliaferro had what might just be the worst final start in NFL history. He would never start another game after this atrocious performance, where he went 3 for 12 with 30 yards passing, no touchdowns, and 4 interceptions, posting a passer rating of 0.0. That's worse than, well, just about everything. It's a 0.0 for crying out loud. When you throw more interceptions than completed passes, you know you messed up. Then you have a 16-0 shutout loss to the New York Giants in a game where the Pats turned it over 3 times, and that was followed up with a 27-3 loss to the Baltimore Colts, where the Pats turned it over 4 times and took 8 sacks. Through 6 weeks, the Patriots were arguably the worst team in football. Their 1-5 record was the worst in the league. Their 68 points scored was the worst offense in the league. Their point differential of -58 was just 5 points shy of the worst point differential in the league. Any way you wanted to slice it, they were bad. But as weird as this entire season was, on November 1st, it would reach arguably its weirdest point yet. November 1st, 1970. We're at Harvard Stadium for this AFC East matchup between the Boston Patriots and the Buffalo Bills. This game signals the halfway point of the season, and for the Patriots, their playoff hopes were completely dashed. They weren't making the postseason with a 1-5 record. Even though you would see the Cincinnati Bengals make it that same year after starting off 1-5, they were in a weak division. Boston simply had too much ground to make up. The Colts were on top at 5-1, and the Dolphins were right behind at 4-2. For Buffalo, they need this win if they want to keep pace for a possible wildcard berth. Lose this game, and you're going to be in the same spot as the Patriots, where you have too much ground to make up and not enough time to do it. But that wasn't the real story entering this game. The real story had to do with the health of head coach Cleve Rush. He had been dealing with some health issues at the time. He checked into Massachusetts General Hospital after the 1969 season ended because he was suffering from nervous exhaustion. He suffered depression, and he was a heavy drinker and an alcoholic. And as he got to Harvard Stadium, something didn't feel right. His heartbeat was irregular, and it was too fast. With that, sometime after pregame warmups but before the opening kickoff, Rush left the venue. He obviously could not be on the sidelines, and went back to the Patriots Motel headquarters to rest up. With that, John Mazur, the team's offensive coordinator, took over as the head coach for this game against the Bills. And not surprisingly, it did not start out well. Buffalo jumped out to an early 10-0 lead in the first quarter and continued to pile it on in the second quarter following a 56-yard touchdown run by O.J. Simpson and a 58-yard pick six by Edgar Chandler in what would not only be the first interception of his career, but would also be the only touchdown of his playing career. The Pats were down 24-0, and things were looking bleak with Mazur on the sidelines calling the shots. So what happened afterwards? For some inexplicable reason, Rush came back. You heard that right. Instead of resting up at the motel after nearly having a heart attack, and instead of just letting his assistants coach the game, Rush decided after going back to the motel that he needed to come back to the stadium. He was clearly not in good health or in any condition whatsoever to coach the game, with reporters who were there describing his walk into the stadium as slow. Still, Rush decided to replace Mazur in the middle of the game and take over as the head coach. The Patriots literally switched coaches in the middle of the game, with the old coach having no idea he was going to become the head coach until minutes before kickoff, and the new coach almost dying an hour before and being in insanely poor health. As you can probably imagine, this did not work out. If it did, there probably would have been a Hollywood movie made about it by now. But the Bills continued to pour it on, and continued to destroy the Patriots in their quest to keep their season alive at the halfway point. Rush took over with 6 minutes left in the first half, and the Patriots down 24-0. By halftime, the lead had grown to 31-0. At one point in the fourth quarter, Buffalo led 38-3. And after Jim Nantz scored the only Pats touchdown of the game on a 19-yard run, Buffalo answered and won it by a final score of 45-10. The game was an unmitigated disaster, with Joe Kapp getting benched and posting a passer rating of 12.3. And the game got so ugly that Buffalo brought out backup quarterback Shaq Harris to play a significant portion of the second half. After the game, there was a ton of confusion as to how and why Rush came back when he was ordered by the doctors to rest up. Not that anyone should be surprised that he defied the doctor's orders after the whole incident he pulled on the bus less than a year prior. While we know that Rush wasn't going into the stadium completely blind, as he was keeping track of the game and how everything was going in the motel room by telephone, no one knows why he even came back in the first place. And what made the whole situation even more bizarre is that moments afterwards, he would step down from his post and would resign, never to coach the Patriots again. Out of concern for his health, Rush decided to resign shortly after the game. It is somewhat confusing since he's listening to the doctors now after not listening to them in the motel just a few hours before, but he stepped down and was placed on an indefinite leave of absence by the team, saying, "I'll never coach this team again." Owner Billy Sullivan relieved Rush of all of his duties until his doctors said he could resume, but that time never came. As his personal physician, Dr. William Baker, said, "After examining the results of the tests, I've recommended that he be granted a leave of absence, effective immediately, because I believe that a continuation of his employment at the time would jeopardize his health unnecessarily." With that, Rush was never a head coach at the NFL level again. John Mazer took over the job with the Patriots on an interim and then eventually a full-time basis. And I talked a bit about that in a previous video of mine, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Rush tried to make it back into the NFL in 1971 on George Allen's staff in Washington as an assistant, but he resigned 6 weeks later. His last venture into football was as the head coach at Merchant Marine Academy in 1976, though he was fired after 1 year from that job. Tragically, in 1980, Rush suffered a sudden heart attack and died at the age of 49. Cleve Rush was a head coach for less than 2 years, and even despite the short time frame, he may have had the most bizarre coaching tenure in NFL history, and it only seems fitting that his final game ever was the strangest of the bunch. At the start of the game, he was in an entirely different location, following the game on a telephone just moments after almost dying. 1 hour later, he was the head coach for the same game. We saw a switcheroo take place in 2013 with the Texans after Gary Kubiak collapsed and was taken to the hospital at halftime, where the coach unfortunately had to leave midway through the game. But a reverse switcheroo, where the coach enters the game midway through? I would be stunned if we see anything like that happening anytime soon. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot, and be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 PM Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9 and subscribe to 60-second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.